His greatest enemy called him the finest king in the world. Not after Saladin died, while they were still at war. The man who wrote those words was Richard I of England, the most feared warrior in all of Christendom, who had crossed an entire sea specifically to destroy everything Saladin had built. And yet, Richard wrote letters to Saladin that sounded less like two men trying to kill each other and more like two old friends who happened to be standing on opposite sides of a very old argument. The question that will stay open in your mind tonight, the one your brain cannot close until we answer it together, is this. On the morning that Saladin finally took back the city that three religions called the most sacred place on earth, when he held the power to do anything he wanted to the people inside those walls, what did he choose? Because the answer will change the way you understand everything that came before it. Before we begin this story together, a small and genuine word. This channel exists because of the people who listen to it. If these stories bring you peace at the end of your day, if they give you something to carry into sleep, you can support this work through the link below. Even the smallest support keeps these stories alive. Now, let us go back. Close your eyes if they are already heavy. You don't have to hold on to anything tonight. Just let the words come slowly, the way a story does when someone you trust is telling it quietly in the dark while the rest of the world goes still. There is nowhere else you need to be right now. Tonight belongs to one man, one life, a story so large and so deeply human that even now, 800 years after his death, historians and scholars and people who simply love a good story are still trying to understand how one person contained all of it. So, let us begin. Let us go back to a world on fire and to a boy nobody expected. The year was 1138. The place was a city called Tikrit, which sits on the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq, and which was in that century a middle-sized administrative town in the enormous and complicated territory controlled by the Seljuk Turkish rulers who dominated much of the Islamic world east of Egypt. Tikrit was not famous. It was not beautiful in the way Damascus was beautiful or Cairo was beautiful. It was functional and dry and full of the kind of people who do the necessary work of an empire without ever being celebrated for doing it. And it was here, in this unremarkable city, in the middle of a season of dust and summer heat, that a Kurdish woman gave birth to a boy who would be named Yusuf. Yusuf ibn Ayyub. That was his full name, and in later life he would be known by the honorific Saladin, which means righteousness of the faith, and which the Crusaders and the European world would shorten and reshape into the name that 8 centuries of history have carried forward, Saladin. We will call him that from the beginning because it is the name that belongs to the man he became. His father was called Najm ad-Din Ayyub, and we will simply call him Najm. He was a Kurdish soldier and administrator, a man of quiet capability who had made himself useful to the Seljuk rulers through the very specific combination of personal reliability and political intelligence that those in power always need more of than they have. Najm was not a great man by the measure of his age. He didn't command armies or sit on thrones. He managed fortresses. He kept order. He paid attention. He was the kind of man who, when things went wrong, people turned to without quite understanding why, and who usually found a way to make them go slightly less wrong. That is its own kind of greatness, though the world rarely names it as such. That was the man Saladin was born to, and that, quietly, would shape everything. The night Saladin came into the world, his father was preparing to leave Tikrit. He had been given new responsibilities at a fortress called Baalbek, further west in what is now Lebanon, a promotion of sorts, a recognition of everything he had managed to prove about himself over years of steady service. The timing was complicated by the birth, and there are accounts that suggest Najm was a man who left nothing unfinished or any responsibility only partially met. So he waited. He stayed in Tikrit until his wife was recovered and the new child was breathing well and the household was settled enough to travel. And then the family packed what they owned and joined the long road west. Saladin was carried out of Tikrit as a newborn, rocking gently through the summer dark, the sound of horses moving steadily beneath him, the smell of dry earth and warm stone, and above him the enormous sky of northern Iraq, filling from horizon to horizon with more stars than any city child would ever see clearly again. He could not know where he was going. He was only days old, but he was already in motion, already being carried towards something, and he would spend much of his life that way, always moving, always crossing the distance between where he was and where the world needed him to be. Let the image of that road hold you for a moment. The dark, the movement, the stars. The world the family was traveling through was not at peace. It had not been at peace in any lasting way for as long as anyone living could remember. The Islamic world of the 12th century was vast and fractured and brilliant and internally exhausted all at once. It stretched from the borders of China in the east to the Atlantic coast of Spain in the west. And within that extraordinary span of territory, it contained 100 kingdoms and 100 languages, and a faith so rich and varied in its interpretations that men who prayed to the same God 5 times a day could still go to war over what the prayer meant. The Seljuk Turks held Persia and Iraq and much of Anatolia. The Fatimid Caliphate held Egypt and had its own claim on religious authority that the Sunni world refused to recognize. Syria was a patchwork of smaller powers, all waiting to see which larger power would eventually absorb them. And to the west, on the coast where the land met the Mediterranean Sea, sat a set of Christian kingdoms that had no right in the Islamic understanding of the world to be there at all. The Crusades. You already know the word, but the word doesn't carry the weight of what it meant to live inside that history, rather than studying it from a comfortable distance. The First Crusade had taken Jerusalem in 1099, 39 years before Saladin was born. The armies of Christian Europe had arrived from the north and the west, and had taken the city in a manner so violent that even the Christian chroniclers who traveled with the armies found themselves recording the horror of what they witnessed alongside the religious triumphalism. Thousands of the city's inhabitants were killed. The streets ran in blood in a way that eyewitness accounts described for decades afterward, because the scale of it could not simply be forgotten. It was one of the most brutal single acts of the medieval military world, and it was not forgotten by anyone who lived within the memory of the faith that the city contained for them. By the time Saladin was born, nearly 40 years had passed. The Crusader kingdoms had taken root. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch. These were not temporary encampments, but real political structures with courts and administrations and populations of mixed religious backgrounds living inside their borders. They had developed trade relationships with Muslim neighbors. They had disputes with each other that had nothing to do with religion. They had become, in the uncomfortable way of things that should never have existed, a permanent feature of the political map. And yet the wound they represented did not close. It could not close. Jerusalem was not simply a political prize to the Islamic world. It was a sacred obligation, the place where, in Islamic belief, the Prophet Muhammad had been carried by night and from which he had ascended to the presence of God. The dome of the rock, the place where prophecy and earth had touched. A Kurdish boy was being carried west in the dark toward a world that had not yet solved this problem. And no one watching the road that night would have imagined for a single breath that this particular child was the solution. That was the man he was becoming. The family settled first in Baalbek, where Najm took charge of the fortress as promised, and then later moved to Damascus, when Najm was transferred again to the service of a man who would become one of the defining figures in Saladin's formation. Damascus first, though, because Damascus deserves a moment. It was one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the known world. Scholars debate the exact number of centuries, but the conservative estimate is close to 11,000 years, which is a span of time so enormous that it becomes difficult to hold in any human mind at full size. By the 12th century, Damascus was the center of a Sunni Islamic world that was simultaneously sophisticated and afraid, rich in scholarship and poor in unity. Its streets were layered with the residue of every civilization that had passed through it, Greek and Roman and Byzantine and Umayyad and Abbasid, and on top of all of that, the living, breathing culture of a city that was still at the center of a world it was trying to save. The smell of jasmine in the old courtyard gardens, the sound of water moving in the channels that had carried the river into the city since before recorded history, the call to prayer arriving across the rooftops in the gray hour before dawn, when the air was cool and still, and the city had not quite remembered yet that it had problems. Saladin grew up learning to read Damascus the way a child learns to read any city, by living inside it completely, by absorbing it through the skin before the mind has the vocabulary to name what it is absorbing. He heard the scholars in the great Umayyad mosque debate points of Islamic law with a precision and a passion that made theology feel less like a subject of study and more like a living conversation that had been going on for centuries and needed him to add something. He watched his father and the men around his father negotiate the impossible politics of a world where alliance and enmity could reverse in a single month, and where the only currency that never devalued was personal reputation. He learned Arabic not simply as a language of communication, but as something closer to a spiritual practice, developing the kind of precision with words that comes from loving language deeply, rather than merely needing it. He also grew up in the household of Nur ad-Din, and this requires some careful attention, because Nur is one of the most important relationships in Saladin's entire life, both as a model and eventually as a complication. Nur was a Seljuk Turkish ruler who had consolidated control over much of Syria and who had built his entire political identity around a single idea that was simultaneously deeply religious and deeply practical. The Islamic world had to unite, not because unity was philosophically elegant, though he believed it was, but because a fragmented Islamic world could not push the Crusader kingdoms back into the sea, and the Crusader kingdoms in the land of the sacred city were an offense that God would not overlook forever and that history would not excuse. Nur was devout in the way that public men are sometimes devout, or sometimes only appear to be. But those who observed him closely over many years wrote that his faith was not a performance. He prayed, he fasted, he gave to the poor from his personal wealth in ways that exceeded any political calculation of advantage. He built hospitals and schools and the institutions of a city that expected to survive and to mean something. He was also unsentimental about power. He knew what it required, and he spent what it required without making himself feel better about the cost. Saladin watched Nur navigate all of this from childhood into early manhood, and what he absorbed from that watching was something that no text could have taught him: the difference between a man who uses faith to justify his power and a man who allows faith to discipline his use of power. Nur was trying to be the second kind of man. He did not always succeed, but he was trying, visibly, every day, in a way that Saladin witnessed and stored away. The Damascus night was quiet in a particular way that those who have lived in very old cities know, a quiet that is full rather than empty, threaded through with the presence of all the generations that have rested in the same darkness before you. Saladin learned in that quiet. He learned from books and scholars and from watching powerful men think. And he learned, perhaps most importantly, from the specific sadness of the world he lived in. The Islamic world of his childhood was not triumphant. It was brilliant and proud and full of genuine achievement in mathematics and astronomy and medicine and literature. And it was also genuinely afraid that it was losing something it could not recover: Jerusalem, the sacred city, the wound that wouldn't close. It ran through every conversation, through every sermon, through every political calculation Saladin heard the men around him making, like a low note in a piece of music that you don't always consciously register, but that gives every higher note its specific feeling. He was perhaps 10 or 11 years old when he began to understand, not as an abstract political fact, but as a felt weight in his body, what Jerusalem meant, not just to his faith, but to the living men and women who carried its loss with them, the way a person carries the loss of a place where something essential happened to them once and which they can no longer return to. He heard the older men describe what the city had been. He heard the younger men argue about what the city should be again. And perhaps, in the way that children absorb the grief of the adults around them before they have the language to name what they have absorbed, he took something of that unresolved ache into himself and never quite put it down. You know the feeling of carrying something unresolved. Everyone does. The thing you haven't yet been able to make right. Saladin carried a version of that from childhood, and it would drive him further and longer and harder than any ambition or pride ever could have. That was the man he was becoming. His uncle Shirkuh entered his life more fully when Saladin was in his mid-teens, and Shirkuh was something Saladin had not yet encountered at close range, a soldier in the old and entire sense of the word, physically courageous to the edge of recklessness, comfortable with danger the way some men are comfortable with quiet, direct in his assessments of people and situations in a way that cut through all the diplomatic layering that characterized the courts Saladin had grown up watching. Shirkuh was also deeply loyal to Nur, to his family, to whatever mission he had committed himself to, with a loyalty that did not waver under difficulty and did not recalculate when the calculation changed. He was, in the vocabulary of his world, a man you could take into battle, and he knew it, and there was no false modesty about it. What Shurka saw in his nephew was something that he recognized, partly because it was so different from himself. The patience, the memory, the ability to sit in a room full of competing agendas and not simply hear what people were saying, but understand what they needed and what they feared. Shurka was good at winning. He understood already, with the particular clarity of a man who has fought and won enough times to think carefully about what winning costs, that the hardest part of winning was knowing what to do next, and that the person who knew what to do next was not always the person who had been the best at the fighting. He brought Saladin into his household. He gave him small responsibilities and watched how they were handled. Not the grand tests, not the ones where everyone is watching and the stakes are obvious, but the daily, quiet tests that reveal character more accurately than any moment of high drama. How does a young man speak to someone who has made a mistake? How does he carry authority he has been given without being asked whether he deserves it? How does he behave when the right thing and the easy thing are not the same thing, and no one important is watching to see which he chooses? Saladin, by every account that survived, chose the right thing, consistently, not dramatically or loudly, quietly, the way a man does when he has made a habit of it rather than a performance. And the cold stone floor of the mosque under bare feet in the early morning prayer, the candle burning in the study where Saladin read past the hour when others had gone to sleep, these small things were the foundation of everything the large things would be built on. That was the man he was becoming. By the time Saladin was in his early 20s, the political world around him was shifting in the way that worlds shift when they are approaching something decisive and don't quite know it yet. Nur had consolidated control of most of Muslim Syria through a combination of military force and the kind of political intelligence that understands when to fight and when to offer terms that the other side can accept without feeling completely destroyed. He was pushing in the direction of Egypt, which was the great prize, the most populated and most wealthy territory in the Islamic world, and the one that, added to Syria, would create a single coherent power capable of actually threatening the Crusader kingdoms from multiple directions simultaneously. Egypt was controlled by the Fatimid Caliphate, and the Fatimids were complicated. They were Shia Muslims in a Sunni world, which meant that their religious authority was disputed by the majority of the Islamic world, even while their political and economic authority was very real and very formidable. Cairo was an extraordinary city, richer than Damascus, and older in its current form, full of scholars and merchants and a bureaucracy that had been running one of the world's most complex economies for generations. The Fatimid caliphs themselves had, by this point in history, become largely ceremonial, the real power resting in the hands of their viziers, their chief ministers, who competed with each other for control of the caliph's name and with it the levers of the state. There was a small boy at the center of all of this enormous machinery, the last surviving heir of a dynasty that was running out of answers. And Nur was watching Egypt the way a chess player watches a piece that has been left slightly too far out of position, watching and calculating and waiting for the moment when the position became a move. He turned to Shurka, and Shurka turned to Saladin. There are historical accounts, fragmented and second-hand, but consistent enough in their details to be credible, suggesting that Saladin felt something close to genuine reluctance about the Egypt campaign. Not cowardice, nothing like that, but the reluctance of a man who has been building a particular kind of life for himself and can see very clearly that saying yes to this will mean setting that life aside for a purpose much larger and more dangerous and more consuming than anything he had planned.
He was building something in Damascus, a reputation for scholarship and governance, a network of relationships, an interior life of faith and learning that suited the man he was when the world wasn't asking anything dramatic of him. Egypt was the opposite of all of that. Egypt was fire and politics and the complete unknown. Perhaps he stood in the dark of his room the night before he gave his answer, the candle burning low on the table, his books arranged in the order he had always kept them. Perhaps he prayed. Those who knew him best in later life always said that when he faced something he was afraid of, he prayed until he was no longer afraid in the way that paralyzes and was only afraid in the way that clarifies. Perhaps he thought of Noor, the man he admired above nearly everyone living, who had built his whole life on the idea that what the sacred city needed was not a man making careful plans for himself, but a man willing to spend himself entirely on something that mattered. And in the morning he gave his answer. Yes, he would go. He packed what he needed. He said whatever prayers a young man says before a departure he cannot fully see the end of, and the road to Egypt opened before him in the early light, long and uncertain and full of everything the rest of his life would be made of. That was the man he was becoming, and he was walking toward it now, finally, after all those years of quiet formation, all those years of learning to hold steady and read carefully and wait for the moment when waiting was no longer what the world required. Egypt was waiting, ancient and golden and burning with its own complicated fires. And somewhere beyond Egypt, just barely visible on the far edge of everything, the city that had been at the center of the story since before Saladin was born, was waiting too. He didn't know yet what he would do when he got there. He was only at the beginning of finding out. But the road was open, and he was walking.
The road to Egypt in 1163 was not a road in any comfortable sense of the word. It was a series of difficult passages through terrain that changed its character every few days, from the managed landscape of settled Syria into the open desert margins where the land forgot that human beings had preferences about temperature and water and shade. Saladin rode with his uncle Shirkuh and an army of Kurdish and Turkish soldiers, some of them veterans of Noor's campaigns across Syria, some of them younger men who were embarking on their first significant test, all of them aware that what they were riding toward was not simply a military expedition, but a bid for something much larger than any of them could hold in full focus yet. The campaign had a political cover, as most campaigns of that era did. There was a Fatimid vizier in Cairo named Shawar, who had been removed from power by a rival and who had come to Noor asking for military help to reclaim his position. In exchange, Shawar had offered what any sensible ruler in his situation would offer, a portion of Egypt's enormous revenues, political alliance, nominal recognition of Noor's authority. It was the kind of deal that looked clean on the surface and had 17 complicated problems underneath it, which any experienced mind could see plainly, and which Noor had calculated were acceptable risks given what Egypt represented as a prize. Saladin was in his mid-20s. He understood the 17 problems. He kept his understanding to himself and watched Shirkuh to see how a man of long experience handles the knowledge that the plan is flawed from the beginning, but the alternative to a flawed plan is no plan at all. The warm smell of horse and leather and dry dust in the long afternoon. The strange beauty of the light just before sunset, when even a desert becomes something you might want to look at for a moment before the dark comes down. They entered Egypt and moved toward Cairo with a swiftness that surprised Shawar's opponents, which was the whole point.
Military advantage in that world was almost entirely a function of time and surprise and the psychological weight of arriving before the other side had fully decided what to do. Shirkuh understood this with the precision of long practice. He moved fast, he moved decisively, and Cairo, which had expected to have longer to prepare, found itself looking at an allied army at its gates before the decision-making process inside the city had reached any firm conclusion. Shawar got his position back. That part worked. What happened next was the first real education Saladin received in the distance between what a man promises when he needs your help and what he delivers when he no longer needs it quite so urgently. Shawar, restored to his vizierate with the help of Shirkuh's army, almost immediately began to look for ways to limit the obligation that restoration had created. He didn't want a powerful ally. He wanted to have had a powerful ally, past tense, at a moment of crisis, and now he wanted that ally to take the gratitude on offer and go home and stay home and leave Egypt to be Egypt without any outside hand on the wheel. He reached out to the Crusaders. This was not as extraordinary as it sounds to modern ears. The political world of the 12th century Middle East was genuinely complicated in its alliances, and Muslim rulers dealing with Crusader kingdoms as political actors rather than purely religious enemies was common practice, however uncomfortable it made the preachers. But for Shirkuh and for Saladin watching Shirkuh absorb the news, it was a clarification. Shawar was not an ally. Shawar was a problem wearing an ally's face, and the problem was now inviting the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army into Egypt to push the Syrian force back out. The combined Egyptian and Crusader army was larger. Shirkuh moved out of Cairo and south, choosing the ground of engagement carefully, the way a smaller force always has to if it wants to survive contact with a larger one. He chose a place called Bilbais near the delta and dug in. The siege was long enough to be exhausting and short enough to avoid becoming catastrophic, and it ended the way many medieval sieges ended, not with a decisive military outcome, but with a negotiation, everyone going home, no one having fully lost and no one having fully won, the fundamental problem still sitting in the center of the room, waiting for the next round.
Saladin had fought at Bilbais. He had held his position under conditions that tested everything he had been building in the quiet years of formation. He had felt fear in the specific way that only actual physical danger produces, a sharpening of the senses that is simultaneously terrifying and clarifying, as if the body knows something the mind is still working out. He had made decisions under pressure and had the particular experience, available only to those who have had it, of making a decision in the middle of danger and feeling it click into place with a certainty that has nothing to do with calculation. He had also felt doubt. That is worth saying plainly, because the historical accounts of men like Saladin tend to compress the uncertainty out of the story in retrospect and leave only the confident arc of a life that always knew where it was going. Saladin did not always know where he was going. At Bilbais, in the nights of that long, uncertain siege, there were hours when he may have wondered whether any of this could be won, whether the fractured world he was trying to hold together with military force and political intelligence was simply too fractured, too old in its fractures, too comfortable with its own divisions to be made whole by anyone. He was young enough to doubt and old enough to keep fighting through the doubt. That combination is rarer than either quality alone. Rest in the darkness of that thought for a moment, the doubt that doesn't stop you. Just let it be there. They went back to Syria. The first Egyptian campaign had ended without resolution. Shirkuh reported to Nur. Nur listened and calculated and waited. And the question of Egypt remained open,
the way questions remain open when neither side has the resources to answer them definitively, and both sides are too committed to let them go. The second Egyptian campaign came 2 years later and was, in several specific ways, worse. The political situation in Cairo had continued to deteriorate. Shawar had continued to play all sides against each other with the frantic energy of a man who understands that he is running out of moves. And the Crusader presence in the region had grown more aggressive. A new king in Jerusalem named Amalric, who had looked at Egypt the way Noor looked at Egypt, and seen the same prize and drawn the same conclusion about the importance of controlling it. Shirkuh moved again. Saladin moved with him. But this campaign found Saladin in a position he had not been in before. He was given independent command of a separate force, a real military responsibility, not a subordinate role, but an actual command with its own objectives and its own burdens and its own specific way of making everything personal in a way that shared responsibility never quite does. When something goes wrong in someone else's command, you witness it. When something goes wrong in your own command, you carry it in your body. Something went wrong. At a place in the Egyptian delta, Saladin's force was caught by a larger Crusader unit under conditions that had more to do with the unpredictable speed of the enemy's movement than any failure of his own judgment. He was outnumbered. He was pinned in terrain that gave the advantage to the larger force. The options he had were limited in the particular way that military options are limited when the situation has moved faster than the planning. He held his force together. He didn't win the engagement, but he didn't collapse. And in the mathematics of that kind of encounter, not collapsing was itself a kind of victory, the preservation of a fighting unit that could withdraw intact and regroup, rather than scatter and be destroyed in pieces. He brought his men back, more of them than the situation had seemed likely to allow. But it was the first time he had held his own command, and it had not gone the way he had intended it to go. And that night, wherever he rested, whatever fire burned low before him, he sat with that feeling. The feeling that is not quite failure, but is not clean success either. The feeling that a different choice at a specific moment might have produced a different result, and that knowing you can't go back to that moment doesn't stop you from returning to it in your mind for much longer than is useful. Those who knew Saladin well in later life and who wrote their observations with the kind of precision that makes them credible recorded that he had a particular relationship with his own mistakes. He was neither the kind of man who couldn't acknowledge them, nor the kind who was destroyed by them. He looked at them directly, and then he put them to work. The mistake became information. The information changed the approach. The changed approach produced a better result. He treated failure the way a scholar treats a text that argues against his current position, not as something to reject or to be ashamed of, but as something that contains something he needed and didn't have before. You have rested long enough tonight to let that idea settle. The failure that teaches instead of defines. That is the specific kind of intelligence that makes a person not just capable, but genuinely dangerous in the best sense. The second Egyptian campaign also ended without full resolution, but this time the departure had the texture of unfinished business rather than defeat. Noor had consolidated elsewhere that pulling the Syrian force back was a political calculation rather than a military necessity. He was building towards something. Everyone around him could feel the shape of it, even if the exact form remained unclear. He was going to try Egypt again, and the third time was going to be different, because by then the relationships inside Egypt itself would have shifted enough to create an opening that no amount of external force could have created on its own.
And here is the question that opens tonight and waits in the dark until we arrive at the answer.
In the years between the Second and Third Egyptian campaigns, while Saladin was living in Damascus and continuing his education in everything that the world of scholarship and faith and governance had to offer, something happened to him privately. Not a military event, not a political development, something interior, something that those who knew him noticed in the change it produced without ever quite being able to describe the change directly. He became, by the time the third campaign began, a different kind of man than the one who had ridden back from Egypt the second time, with that unresolved feeling sitting in his chest. Not harder, something more interesting than harder. What happened to Saladin in those quiet years in Damascus that completed him in the way that no amount of campaigning could have? We will return to that question, but not yet. The city of Damascus itself was part of the answer, and the answer requires understanding what Damascus was asking of the people who lived inside it. The great mosque at the center of the city was not simply a place of worship in the way that phrase can sometimes suggest, a merely functional building. It was the living center of an intellectual tradition that had been accumulating for 4 centuries, where scholars of Islamic law and theology and philosophy gathered not just to pray, but to argue and to teach and to build on what had been built before them, with the specific ambition of a tradition that believed it contained something important and was responsible for carrying it forward without letting it thin or diminish. Saladin spent time there, real time, not ceremonial attendance, but the kind of sustained engagement that changes a person from the inside by filling certain gaps that talent and experience alone cannot fill. He studied with scholars whose names the historical record preserves with the reverential specificity that those periods reserved for genuine intellectual achievement. He developed a depth of engagement with Islamic jurisprudence and theology that would later surprise visitors who expected a military man and found instead someone who could sit with scholars for hours without either performing comprehension or losing the thread. This was not ornamental learning, not the studied literacy of a ruler who wanted to appear educated. It was the interior work of a man building a foundation that he understood, perhaps without being able to fully articulate why, would need to hold a very large weight someday. His faith deepened in the Damascus years. This is important to say clearly, because faith in this context is not a simple thing and deserves not to be described simply. He was not becoming more outwardly religious in the way that sometimes indicates an increase in performance rather than substance. He was becoming more inwardly grounded, more able to hold difficulty without being disturbed by it in the way that shakes a person off their own center. He prayed with the consistency and the specific quality of attention that those around him described not as duty being performed, but as conversation being continued, the ongoing private conversation of a man with something he trusted absolutely in a world where almost nothing else could be trusted absolutely. The cool stone floor of the mosque in the hour before dawn, when the city was still dark and still, and the prayer was the only sound moving through the air. He was also, in those Damascus years, learning governance, not from texts alone, but from the actual practice of administration, taking on responsibilities within the system that Nur had built, and discovering the specific difference between understanding the system from the outside and running a portion of it from the inside. Systems are always more complicated from the inside. The people in them are more various, more resistant to simple categorization, more capable of surprising you in both directions than any map of the system suggests. Saladin proved himself to be someone who handled the complexity without either simplifying it dishonestly or being paralyzed by it. He made decisions. He was fair.
People who dealt with him professionally left those dealings with the impression that had been heard, and that what was decided had been decided on the basis of what was actually true rather than what was politically convenient. That reputation, built quietly in Damascus across those years, was not nothing. In a world where reputation was one of the primary currencies of power, building it slowly and genuinely was the most reliable way to build it at all. Nur watched, as he had always watched, with the particular attention of a man who had been looking for something without being entirely certain what it looked like, and who was beginning to suspect he might have found it in an unlikely place. The question of Egypt came back around in 1168, and this time the circumstances have changed in the specific ways that Nur had been waiting for. Amalric of Jerusalem had moved into Egypt with force, applying direct military pressure to Cairo in a way that removed Shawar's ability to continue his delicate game of playing everyone against each other and forced a genuine choice. He could accept Crusader domination and become essentially a client state of Jerusalem, or he could turn back to the Islamic world and accept whatever that turning back would cost him in terms of his own independence. He turned back. He asked Nur for help, and this time the help came with different terms. Shirkuh moved for the third time towards Egypt. Saladin rode with him, but the Saladin who rode with him this time was not the same young man who had made that first uncertain journey across the desert 6 years before. He was thinner and quieter and more certain than he had been, carrying the failures and the learning of the previous campaigns in his body, the way a tree carries the record of its difficult years in its rings, not visibly, but as structural, as a part of what makes it able to stand.
The third campaign moved through Egypt with a speed and confidence that reflected what everyone involved had learned the first 2 times. Shirkuh understood the terrain. He understood the politics. He understood which Egyptian commanders could be won and which had to be bypassed, and which simply needed to be confronted with a reality too large to argue with. Cairo watched the approach and made its calculation. Shawar's position was untenable, and the people around him knew it before he did, which is often the way with men at the center of failing situations, the last to see clearly what everyone on the edges has seen for some time. Shawar was killed in early 1169. The historical accounts differ in their details on the specifics of how, but they agree on the essential fact: he was gone, and with him the last obstacle to Shirkuh assuming the vizierate of Egypt on behalf of a Fatimid caliph who at this point had very little choice about what he was agreeing to. Shirkuh became vizier of Egypt. It was the achievement of a military lifetime, the culmination of 3 campaigns across years of difficulty and one very specific kind of victory. He lived to enjoy it for 2 months. In March of 1169, Shirkuh died. The cause, by the accounts most historians find credible, was related to his health, which had been declining for some time, the accumulated cost of years of campaigning finally arriving at a reckoning that no amount of willpower could postpone. He had been a large man, with the specific appetites of someone who had spent his life denying himself nothing he could reach, and the body keeps its own accounts, regardless of what the mind demands of it. He was gone, and the vizierate of Egypt, the most powerful administrative position in the most wealthy territory in the Islamic world, was suddenly without its holder. The people around Saladin moved with the speed of people who understand that a vacancy in a powerful position lasts exactly as long as the weakest candidate takes to decide not to compete for it. There were other candidates. There were senior commanders with stronger formal claims on paper and longer records of service to the cause. There were men who looked at the position from the outside and saw a prize and began immediately calculating the path to it. There was also a Kurdish man in his early 30s who had buried his uncle
and was sitting in the specific quiet of someone who has just lost the person who believed in him most completely and earliest and without condition, and who was trying to understand what the grief required of him before he tried to understand what the world was about to require. He was named Vizier. It is not entirely clear from the records available how Saladin received this news, whether he felt the weight of it as enormity or as obligation, or as both of those things arriving simultaneously in the body. He was 31 years old. He was now responsible for the administration of Egypt, the largest and most complex political entity in the Islamic world, in a political situation so delicate and so full of competing pressures that the previous man in the job had lasted 2 months before his heart gave out. The Fatimid Caliph was watching from his palace. Nur was watching from Damascus. The Crusader kingdoms were watching from the coast. And the Sunni scholars who had never recognized the Fatimid religious authority were watching to see what a Sunni vizier in a Shia caliphate would do with the position and what it would mean for the larger unity that Nur had been building toward for decades. Everyone was watching. Saladin sat somewhere in Cairo that first night of his new responsibility, and the city outside was vast and dark and full of sounds he was still learning to read. And above it the stars were the same stars that had been above him on the road from Tikrit as a newborn child, the same sky that had watched everything he had learned, and everything he had survived, and everything he had become. He was at the beginning of something. He could feel it, the way you feel a change in the air before a storm that hasn't arrived yet, but has decided it is coming. The question was what kind of man he would be inside this new and enormous thing. He had been the student, he had been the soldier, he had been the nephew and the subordinate, and the careful learner storing everything for a purpose he couldn't yet see clearly. Now there was no more storing. Now there was only the doing. Cairo in 1169 was a city that had been managing its own contradictions for so long that it had developed a kind of institutional expertise in not resolving them. The Fatimid Caliphate had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries, and in those 2 centuries it had built something genuinely extraordinary, a civilization of enormous sophistication and beauty, resting on a religious authority that the majority of the Islamic world disputed, and a political structure that had been slowly hollowing out from the inside, the caliphs becoming more ceremonial and more isolated, while the real power moved through the hands of whoever held the vizierate. Saladin now held the vizierate, and the question of what that meant was going to answer itself whether he directed the answer or not. He began with the things he could control: administration, order, the daily machinery of a state that had been running on momentum and anxiety for long enough that its actual mechanisms needed someone to look at them clearly and decide what was working and what was surviving only because no one had yet made the decision to stop it. He was methodical in a way that surprised people who expected a soldier. He went through the structures of Egyptian governance with the patience of a man who had spent years in Damascus studying how systems were supposed to work, and therefore could recognize quickly where this one had drifted from its own best design. He kept what was working. He changed what wasn't. He was not brutal about it, not in the way that new power sometimes announces itself through the humiliation or destruction of what came before. He was precise. He separated the institution from the person holding the institution, and where the person needed to be replaced, he replaced them without drama, placing into the position someone he had reason to trust, and then watching carefully to see whether his reason was justified.
He also, in those first months, did something that took the people around him a moment to understand, and then struck them as exactly right in the way that good decisions always seem obvious in retrospect. He began building hospitals, schools, the infrastructure of a city that was planning for a future rather than simply managing a present.
He spent money on these things from the public treasury, with the specific confidence of a man who understands that an administration's credibility is built as much by what it creates as by what it controls. The people of Cairo noticed, not all at once, and not with any dramatic collective recognition, but the way that people always notice when the quality of the authority over them has changed, through small accumulated experiences of being treated as if they matter, through the gradual disappearance of a particular kind of low-grade daily fear that comes from living under power that is arbitrary, through the very specific relief of an administration that appears to be running towards something rather than simply away from its own collapse. The warm smell of bread from the market stalls in the early morning, the sound of water in the old channels running through the city, these were the sounds of a place beginning to breathe differently. Now, the answer to the question that was left open in Damascus, the question of what happened to Saladin in those quiet years that completed him in a way no campaign could have. The answer is grief, and its companion, which is a very specific kind of love. In the years between the Second and Third Egyptian campaigns, Saladin lost several people who were close to him, not in battle, but to illness and to time, the losses that don't have the clarity of a military death, but arrive slowly and leave a different kind of mark. He sat with those losses in the way that people sit with losses when they are not yet powerful enough for the world to require them to be composed about everything all the time, with genuine feeling, without the armor that comes later when being seen to grieve becomes complicated by what it might mean to the people watching. What those losses gave him was a quality that the scholars and chroniclers who knew him in later life returned to again and again in their attempts to describe what made him different from the other powerful men of his age. He was genuinely able to feel what other people felt, not as a technique, not as a political skill carefully developed, as a natural and unavoidable consequence of having been opened by his own grief and having chosen, in that opening, to let the understanding of other people's pain come in rather than closing against it. This is the thing the military campaigns couldn't have taught him, the ability to walk into a room full of people in distress and have them feel, without anything being said explicitly, that the man in front of them knew what distress felt like from the inside, that he wasn't looking at their suffering from a position of comfortable distance and deciding charitably to care about it. He was recognizing it. There is a difference that everyone who has ever experienced both kinds of attention can identify immediately and without being able to fully explain. That is what the Damascus years completed, and it made him something rarer than a brilliant general or a skilled administrator. It made him a man that people would follow past the point where calculation justified following. Let that settle in the quiet for a moment. The thing that made him great was the thing that hurt him first. The political situation with the Fatimid Caliphate resolved itself in 1171, and the resolution had the inevitability of things that have been structurally determined for a long time and are only waiting for the right sequence of events to make the structural reality visible. The Al-Adid was dying. He was young and had been ill for some time, and the illness was the kind that only moves in one direction. The question of what happened to Egypt's religious identity when the Fatimid line ended was not a question anyone had to resolve artificially. It resolved itself. The Friday prayers in Cairo's mosques, which had for 2 centuries been said in the name of the Fatimid Caliph and his Shia authority, began to be said in the name of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, the Sunni authority that the majority of the Islamic world recognized. Saladin did not make this happen violently. He made it happen by being present and steady while it happened, managing the transition with the specific kind of administrative care that prevents a moment of change from becoming a moment of chaos. Al-Adid died without knowing that the prayers had changed, which some historians have called a mercy and others have called a political calculation, and both assessments are probably partially right. Egypt was now Sunni. Egypt was now, in the deeper sense that mattered to Nur and to the vision of a unified Islamic world capable of addressing the Crusader presence, part of the same world as Syria. Nur was pleased, and then Nur began to worry, because the man he had sent to manage Egypt had done something considerably more than manage it. He had made it his, not through any act of disloyalty, not through any declaration of independence, but through the simple and unstoppable mechanism of being genuinely good at governing it, of the population of Cairo actually behind him in the specific way that populations get behind leaders who have demonstrated that they regard the population as a responsibility rather than a resource.
There is something I want to stop and share with you here, something that most of the histories of Saladin move past too quickly, and which I find myself returning to every time I sit with this story. Saladin was funny, not in the broad, performative way that powerful men sometimes deploy humor as a social tool to make the people around them feel comfortable enough to be useful. He was genuinely, quietly, warmly funny in the way that people are funny when they find the world actually amusing rather than threatening, when they have enough interior security to notice the absurdity in situations without needing to either control the absurdity or pretend it isn't there. The accounts left by people who spent real time with him, diplomats and scholars and soldiers, and the various visitors that his court attracted as his reputation grew, are consistent on this point in a way that feels credible precisely because it's unexpected. He laughed easily. He told stories well. He had a particular fondness for wordplay in Arabic that demonstrated genuine facility with the language's enormous capacity for multiple meanings, and he enjoyed enormously the company of people who could keep up with him in that kind of conversation. He was, by these accounts, delightful to spend an evening with, warm and curious, and genuinely interested in the person in front of him in the way that makes a person feel, for the duration of the conversation, that they are the most interesting thing the most powerful man in the room has encountered in some time. I love this about him. I love it because it reminds us that the enormous weight of what he was trying to do in the world did not make him heavy in himself, that he had found a way to carry the responsibility without letting the responsibility become his entire identity. He was a man who prayed 5 times a day and wept at the deaths of those he loved, and laughed at a good joke, and sat with scholars for hours, and rode into battle without flinching, and could not, by all accounts, walk past a person in genuine distress without stopping to see what could be done. He was, in other words, complete. Not perfect, complete. There is a difference that matters. Let the warmth of that settle around you, the quiet room, the story moving through it like water. The tension with Nur al-Din came to its own resolution, as tensions do when one of the two parties involved dies before they can become a war. Nur al-Din died in 1174, leaving a son who was 11 years old, and a Syrian power structure that immediately began fracturing along the fault lines that Nur al-Din's own authority had been holding together. The various princes and commanders who had been bound by loyalty to the man found themselves considerably less bound by loyalty to the child, and the fragmentation that Nur al-Din had spent his career preventing began almost immediately. Saladin moved from Egypt toward Damascus. He did not describe this movement as conquest. He described it as protection. He had come to protect the young heir from the fragmentation that was threatening to undo everything Nur al-Din had built, to hold together the unified Islamic Syria that Nur al-Din had made his life's work, and that was now in danger of dissolving back into the competing principalities it had been before him. Some historians accept this framing. Others are more skeptical. The truth probably contains both things simultaneously, as political actions usually do when they are performed by genuinely complicated people.
He probably did believe that he was the best available custodian of Nur al-Din's vision. He was also absolutely acquiring power. Both of these can be true at the same time without either canceling the other. He entered Damascus in 1174 to genuine popular welcome. This is the important detail. He did not enter as a conqueror, navigating a hostile population. He entered as a returning figure, recognizable to a city that had formed him and that recognized in the man arriving something of what it had invested in the boy. Damascus received him the way a city receives something it already knows but is seeing fully for the first time. And then the work of the next decade began. The years between 1174 and 1187 were the years of consolidation, the long, patient work of building a political and military structure capable of accomplishing the thing that had been the unspoken center of the entire project since before Saladin's first journey to Egypt. He moved through the Islamic world systematically, not with the indiscriminate violence of conquest, but with the specific, targeted pressure of a man who understood that what he was building required the genuine cooperation of the people inside it, rather than just their submission. Aleppo, Mosul, the various Syrian principalities that had been independent or semi-independent under the previous arrangement. He negotiated where he could. He fought where he had to. He was generous in victory to a degree that continually surprised his opponents and was not, by the evidence of his consistent behavior across many years, a calculation, but a disposition. When he won, he offered terms. When the terms were accepted, he kept them. When he promised safety, he provided safety. His word became, across years of being kept, one of the most valuable political assets in the region. He was also building an army, not just in the logistical sense, though he was doing that too, the careful accumulation of soldiers and supplies and the military infrastructure that sustained campaigns of the scale he was planning. He was building an army in the cultural sense, a fighting force that understood what it was fighting for with enough clarity and depth that the understanding itself became a military asset. Soldiers who know why they are fighting, who have a felt connection to the thing their effort is protecting, who trust the man leading them because that trust has been earned rather than demanded. These soldiers perform differently than soldiers who are simply being paid or compelled.
The dust of the training grounds in the early morning. The sound of prayer rising over an army camp at dawn. Thousands of voices joining the same words at the same moment. The specific sound of a large group of human beings in agreement about something that matters to them. And I wonder, listening back through this part of his story, whether you have ever been inside something larger than yourself in that same way, whether you have ever been part of a group, a family, a community, a cause that gave your effort a meaning it couldn't have had alone. Whether you have ever felt the specific quality of purpose that comes not from ambition, but from belonging to something you genuinely believe in. Saladin built his army on exactly that feeling, and it was the most durable thing he built. If that question reaches something in your own life, I would love to read what it reaches in the comments. I read every one. The years passed. The structure grew, and the Crusader kingdoms, watching from the coast, watched a transformation taking place in the Islamic world around them that their political analysis had not fully anticipated and that their military planning had not adequately prepared for. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 1180s was not the unified, confident entity it had been at its height. It had its own fractures. A king named Baldwin IV, who was afflicted with leprosy and who governed from behind a mask, with a courage and intelligence that even his enemies respected, managing his kingdom's survival through diplomatic skill, while his own body was slowly making less and less of him.
a court full of competing factions, the older families who had been in the Crusader kingdoms long enough to develop a nuanced understanding of their Muslim neighbors, and the newer arrivals from Europe who brought with them the uncomplicated certainties of people who had not yet had to live inside the complexity. Saladin watched. He probed. He tested the boundaries with raids and engagements that were large enough to demonstrate capability and small enough to avoid the full confrontation that he was not yet ready for. He was waiting for the right moment, in the specific way that a man waits when he knows the moment will come and knows that arriving at it too early is as dangerous as missing it entirely. The moment arrived because of the man named Reynold. Reynold of Chatillon was one of those historical figures whose existence seems almost designed to demonstrate what happens when a person of genuine military ability is combined with a complete absence of the political intelligence required to understand when ability needs to be restrained. He held the fortress of Kerak in the south, which controlled the trade routes between Egypt and Syria, and he raided those routes with the specific disregard for consequence of someone who is either very brave or very certain that someone else will manage the consequences for him. He raided a caravan in 1186. This was not his first raid, and not his first violation of the truces that the more thoughtful Crusader leadership had maintained with Saladin, out of the very rational understanding that their long-term survival required managing the relationship rather than constantly provoking it. But this raid was different in its specifics. The caravan was large, the people in it were prominent, and among them, by the account that Saladin later gave and that the historical record supports, was a member of his own family. Saladin sent to Jerusalem demanding the release of the captives and the return of the goods, which was the standard procedure, and which the standard procedure of the period would have required the Jerusalem court to provide. The Jerusalem court, in the middle of its own succession crisis and its own factional conflicts, did not provide it. Reynold refused. Saladin looked at what had happened. He looked at what it meant, and he made the decision that had been building across decades of preparation and patience and the long, slow accumulation of everything required to make it possible. He called his army together, the full army, not a raiding force, not a probing expedition, but the gathered military power of a unified Egypt and Syria under a single commander who had spent 15 years building exactly this capability for exactly this purpose. 12,000 cavalry, a force of infantry that the sources describe in numbers that vary enough to indicate they were large enough to make precise counting difficult, the full weight of everything he had built. He moved north from Egypt and west from Syria toward a meeting point in the Jordan Valley, and the army that assembled at that meeting point was, by the assessment of every military observer who looked at it from inside or outside, the most formidable single Islamic force that had been gathered in the region since before the First Crusade. The Crusader kingdom looked at what was coming and summoned everything it had. The two forces were heading toward each other across a landscape of extraordinary beauty and absolute dryness in the early summer of 1187, the hills of Galilee golden and bare in the heat, the Sea of Galilee visible in the distance, the specific quality of light in that part of the world that makes everything look as though it is being seen through a memory rather than directly. And here is the question that historians have turned over for 8 centuries and which we will sit with tonight before sleep takes you fully. On the night before the most consequential battle of his life, the battle that would decide everything he had spent 15 years building toward, when his army was camped on one side of those dry hills, and the Crusader army was camped on the other, and the morning would bring the collision of everything, what did Saladin do in the hours before dawn? Not what his generals did, not what his commanders prepared. What did he, alone, do in the dark before the day that would change the world?
The answer to that question is in the battle that was coming. And the battle was coming with the unstoppable logic of everything that had led to this moment. Every decision, every loss, every quiet year of learning, and every loud year of fighting, and every night of prayer, and every morning of riding out into whatever the world had prepared. The hills were dark. The army was still. Somewhere in that stillness, a man who had been a newborn on a road out of Tikrit, and a student in the mosque of Damascus, and a soldier at Bilbais, and a grieving nephew, and a vizier, and a sultan, was sitting with the night before the most important morning of his life. And the stars above him were the same stars that had always been above him, the same enormous, indifferent, beautiful sky that had watched everything he had been and everything he was still becoming. The Battle of Hattin came on the 4th of July, 1187, and it was over before the day was fully spent. The details of how Saladin won it are worth carrying with you, because the victory was not simply a matter of superior numbers, though the numbers were on his side. It was the victory of a mind that had spent 15 years studying exactly this problem from every available angle. The Crusader army, led by the King of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, had made the decision to march across dry ground toward water in the midsummer heat, which put them in the position of an army that needs to arrive somewhere in order to survive, rather than an army that can choose when and how to engage. Saladin understood this. He moved to deny them the water they were marching toward. The Crusader force spent the night before the battle dying of thirst on a dry plateau above the Sea of Galilee, the water visible in the distance below them, Saladin's army between them and everything they needed. His men lit fires through the night, adding smoke and the smell of burning brush to the heat and the thirst and the exhaustion of an army that had already spent too long in conditions that stripped the edge from fighting men before any weapon was raised. It was not a chivalric gesture. It was a precise tactical decision made by someone who understood that a battle won before dawn is a battle won at lower cost than a battle won at midday. And this answers the question that was left open at the close of the night before. What Saladin did in the hours before Hattin was not rest, and it was not prayer alone, though he prayed. He worked. He was moving through his own lines in the dark, speaking to his commanders, checking the positions of the fires, ensuring that every piece of the design he had built through the previous week of maneuvering was exactly where it needed to be when the light came. He was the last person in his army to sleep, and in all likelihood he did not sleep at all, because the specific quality of attention he was bringing to the arrangement of everything was the attention of a man for whom sleep would have been a kind of abandonment of the people depending on him to have thought of every detail. That was the answer. He was working. In the dark before the most important morning of his life, he was still serving. The battle in the morning was devastating for the Crusader force. The thirst and the smoke and the exhaustion had done their work before the fighting began. The Crusader cavalry charged repeatedly and was turned back repeatedly, and the infantry, without water and without the ability to hold a coordinated formation on broken ground against a mobile force that could choose its angles of engagement, slowly collapsed. Guy of Lusignan was captured,
The true cross, the most sacred relic in the Crusader world, was taken. Reynold of Chatillon was brought before Saladin in the aftermath. Saladin offered Guy water. He did not offer Reynold water. He looked at the man who had raided the caravan, who had broken the truces, who had given every opportunity that political reason and human patience could provide, and had chosen each time to treat the opportunity as an invitation to do the same thing again, and he told Reynold plainly that he would answer for what he had done. He killed Reynold himself, not in rage, in a kind of cold and deliberate justice that those who were present described as something different from either anger or cruelty. It was the specific act of a man who concluded that some obligations cannot be delegated. Guy he released eventually, because Guy was a king, and the conventions of warfare among men of that rank had their own logic, and because Saladin was consistently the kind of man who, having won completely, did not need to prove the winning by destroying everything in reach. Hattin opened the road to Jerusalem. And here is the third question that will stay open in your mind tonight, the one that needs an answer before you can rest fully in what this story means. In the months after Hattin, as city after city of the Crusader kingdoms fell to Saladin's advancing force, something happened in the way he treated the people inside those cities that the military world of the 12th century had simply not seen before. Not once or twice, but consistently, city after city, case after case. What principle was Saladin applying, and where did it come from? Because it did not come from military calculation, and it did not come from political strategy. It came from somewhere much older and much more private than either of those things. Jerusalem surrendered in October of 1187. And now we go somewhere that the histories of battles and campaigns you usually do not take us, because part 4 belongs to the general, or the sultan, or the political architect of a unified Islamic world. It belongs to the man, the private man, the man beneath everything he had built and everything the world had decided he was.
Before we go there, go back for a moment. Go back to the very beginning of this story, to the road out of Tikrit, to the newborn carried west in the dark by a father who had waited to make sure his household was in order before he traveled. Go back to what was said about Najm, the father. Quiet capability, personal reliability, political intelligence. The man who, when things went wrong, people turned to without quite understanding why, who usually found a way to make them go slightly less wrong. That was described as its own kind of greatness that the world rarely names. Now you know his son. Now you have heard the whole shape of the life. And the thing that should recontextualize every word of that beginning is this. Saladin was his father. Not in the diminished sense of a child who simply replicates a parent, in the deeper sense of a child who took what his father was at a modest scale and discovered that the same qualities, carried further and tested harder and given a larger stage, produced a life that changed the world. Every single thing said about Najm at the beginning of this story was also true of Saladin at its height. Every single thing. The world didn't name it in the father. The world has been naming it in the son for 8 centuries, and the father never knew. He died before any of it happened, before Egypt, before Damascus, before Hattin, before Jerusalem. He died a capable and reliable administrator in a middle-sized political structure, and he never knew what he had given the world. There is something in that which takes a long time to feel fully.
The private man, then. Saladin was afraid of the dark in a specific way that has nothing to do with literal darkness. He was afraid of being the last one standing. He was afraid of outliving the people he loved best, and he was given ample reason to be afraid of this, because the people he loved best had a way of leaving before him: his uncle, his father, his brothers in arms who fell in the various campaigns of the preceding decades. And each departure left him with a slightly larger portion of the world to hold on his own, and a slightly smaller number of the people whose opinion of him had ever been entirely unclouded by what he represented. The loneliness of his position is one of the things the histories tend to skip past, because loneliness is not dramatic in the way that battles are dramatic. And yet everyone who spent extended time with Saladin in the years of his greatest power recorded, in one form or another, the specific quality of his company that suggested a man who was genuinely glad to be with you, more glad than his position required him to perform. Glad in the specific way of someone for whom the presence of another person they can speak to honestly is not a convenience, but a relief. He talked to scholars, he talked to poets, he talked to the various judges and religious figures who passed through his court, and he talked to them in a way that was less like a powerful man receiving subordinates, and more like someone who has questions that power cannot answer, and who is looking with genuine hope for someone who has thought about the same questions long enough to have something useful to say about them. He had questions about death. This is not as morbid as it sounds. He was a man of deep Islamic faith, and in that faith, the conversation about death is not a conversation about fear, but a conversation about preparation, about the difference between a life spent accumulating things that stay behind and a life spent becoming something that goes forward. But faith doesn't eliminate the human feeling. It holds the human feeling and gives it somewhere to go, which is different from making it disappear. He knew that what he had built would outlast him only if the things it was built on outlasted him, and he was not certain that they would, and the uncertainty was one he carried quietly in a place that the public man was never required to show. He wept. This is recorded by multiple sources and with the specificity that makes it credible rather than constructed. He wept at the deaths of people he cared about with a completeness that those around him sometimes found startling, not because weeping was unusual, but because the degree of it was, because a man with that much power weeping that completely suggested an interior life that the power had not managed to protect or seal off or convert into something more composed. He wept at beauty, too. Specific sources record him weeping at particularly moving recitations of the Quran, at certain passages of poetry in Arabic that touched something he couldn't quite account for, at the sight of things that combined great age with great meaning, old mosques, ancient cities, places where the human effort to reach towards something larger than itself had accumulated over centuries into something that felt like evidence rather than aspiration. This is the mirror moment I have been moving towards since the beginning of this story, and I want you to hold it gently before sleep takes you, because it is the most human thing about him and the thing that history most nearly lost. There is a letter, not famous, not the kind of letter that gets quoted in the books about Saladin that focus on military strategy. A letter he wrote to one of his brothers, late in the years of the great campaigns, in a period when the political and military pressures were enormous, and the personal costs were accumulating in ways that even his extraordinary reserves of patience and commitment were finding difficult to absorb. The letter has not survived completely. What has survived is a fragment recorded by a scholar who saw it and copied a portion of it into his own writings, with the note that it seemed to him to contain something essential about the man that the battles did not.
In the fragment, Saladin wrote something that translates, across the 8 centuries and the enormous distance of language and culture, into something approximately like this: that he was tired in a way that sleep could not touch, that he understood why the thing he was doing needed to be done, that he was not asking to be released from the doing of it, but that he wanted someone to know, someone who knew him as a person rather than as a position, that there was a cost, that the carrying of it had a weight that he could not put down in public and could barely acknowledge in private, that he was asking God to give him enough, not more than enough, just enough to finish what had been started, and to finish it in a way that was worthy of everyone who had trusted him with their lives and their hopes. Just enough to finish it in a way that was worthy. There is no human being alive tonight who has not felt some version of what is in those words, not at the scale of Saladin's life, not carrying what he was carrying, but the feeling itself, the tiredness that sleep cannot touch, the thing you have committed to that you are not asking to be released from, but that you need, just for a moment, someone to know has a cost. The prayer that is not for victory or abundance, but for enough, just enough to do it right. That is what he was. Under the campaigns and the armies and the unified Islamic world and the administration of Egypt and the capture of Jerusalem, he was a man who sometimes sat alone and wrote letters asking for enough. If you are lying in the dark tonight carrying something heavy that you haven't been able to put down, I want you to know that he was too. The greatest commander of the medieval world was too, and it did not diminish him. It made him exactly the kind of man who could be trusted with the enormous thing that the world was about to ask of him. Because the people who never feel the weight are not the ones you want holding something precious. The ones you want are the ones who feel it completely and carry it anyway. Let that sit with you in the dark. You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to need just enough. Jerusalem. The entry into Jerusalem in October of 1187 is the answer to the question planted at the very beginning of this story, the question of what he chose when he held the power to do anything he wanted to the people inside those walls. He had an army outside a city that had been taken from the Islamic world 88 years before in an act of violence so extreme that it had lived in the memory of multiple generations as a defining wound. He had the military force to take that city in any manner he chose. There were voices among his commanders and his advisors who argued for reciprocal justice, for the city to be taken the way the city had been lost, for the 88 years of accumulated grief to be answered in kind. Saladin listened to those voices. He understood where they came from. He did not dismiss the feeling behind them, because the feeling was real, and the history was real, and the grief was real. He held all of that, and then he chose something else. He negotiated the surrender. He set a ransom for the city's inhabitants and allowed those who could pay it to leave freely. For those who couldn't, he allowed his own brothers and commanders to pay the ransom from their own resources for large numbers of the poor. His own brother is recorded to have led a group of freed captives out through one gate while Saladin watched.
when those sources record what his expression was as he watched, the word they consistently use is not triumph, it is not satisfaction, it is something closer to relief. He let the poor go free, many of them, by multiple accounts, without any ransom being paid at all, because the machinery of processing thousands of people through a ransom system broke down under the weight of the numbers, and because Saladin, observing the breakdown, let it continue rather than enforcing the system against people who had nothing. The Christian places of worship in the city were not destroyed. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not torn down. He could have. The political logic of eliminating the physical center of the faith that had sent armies to take this city was available to him if he had wanted to use it. He didn't use it. And the principle behind all of this, the answer to the question of where it came from, is not complicated, though it is profound. It came from faith, not from a calculation of political benefit, not from a desire to appear magnanimous in the eyes of the world, not from a military assessment of what level of violence was necessary and efficient. It came from the specific conviction, lived out through prayer and scholarship and the long formation of a man who had spent his life trying to become worthy of the thing he was trying to do. That how you win matters as much as whether you win. That God is watching not just the outcome, but the manner. That a city retaken in the manner it was losing would carry that manner forward in its stones and its history and its meaning forever. He wanted Jerusalem to mean something different than what it had meant when it was taken from the world he was part of. He wanted to give it back as a gift rather than a wound.
The answer to the third curiosity loop question is this. The principle he was applying was mercy, and mercy, in his understanding, was not weakness. It was the most demanding thing a person with complete power could practice, the choice to have the capacity for something and to decide that what the moment required was its opposite. That principle came from the Quran. It came from the scholarly tradition he had absorbed in the Mosque of Damascus in the quiet years. It came from watching Nur apply faith as a discipline rather than a justification. It came from the grief that had opened him and the love that had come through the opening. It came from every single thing that had happened to him from the road out of Tikrit to the gates of Jerusalem. It came from Najm, who had waited in Tikrit until his household was in order. It came from a father who believed that how you do a thing is part of the thing itself. The historians who were there, both Muslim and Christian, and there were Christian chroniclers who witnessed or had reliable reports of the Jerusalem surrender and wrote about it, used the same word across multiple languages and traditions. They called it mercy. The ones who had expected something different, who had arrived at the reporting of this event with the expectation of recording a horror, found themselves instead recording something they didn't entirely have the vocabulary for. A military commander with complete power, choosing in the moment of complete victory to behave as though the people he had defeated were still people. One of the Christian sources wrote something that the historians have been quoting ever since because it contains a specific quality of honest bewilderment that gives it a credibility beyond the obvious sources. He wrote, and this is a close paraphrase because the exact words belong to a man who wrote them 800 years ago, that what happened at Jerusalem that day was more than he had deserved to witness, that it seemed to him to be a lesson that would take him the rest of his life to fully understand, and that he did not know whether it shamed him or whether it simply made him want to be a better man, but that it had done one or the other, and he was not sure there was a difference. The city was quiet that night. The old city of Jerusalem, with its ancient stones that had absorbed the prayers and the violence and the grief and the hope of three faiths across more centuries than any living person could count, was quiet. Saladin walked through it.
The accounts differ on the details, but agree on the image. A man walking through a city he had spent the better part of his adult life moving toward. Walking through it in the evening, when the light in Jerusalem has a specific quality that travelers have been noting with something close to religious language for as long as people have been writing about that place. Gold and old and carrying more history than seems possible for light to carry. He was 49 years old. He had been in motion, genuinely in motion, for nearly his entire adult life. The campaigns and the administrations and the negotiations and the building and the grief and the prayer and the diplomacy and the fighting and the letters written in the dark to brothers who knew him as a person rather than a position. He stood in Jerusalem. And what he felt in the privacy of that moment, in the specific hour when the thing that had been the center of the entire enormous enterprise was finally, after everything, accomplished, we do not know. The accounts don't reach inside that moment. The historians who were there were watching from the outside and could only record what they saw, which was a man standing in a city in the evening light, very still, in the way that a person is still when something so large has just happened that the body needs a moment before it can understand what posture is appropriate. He may have wept. He was a man who wept. He may have prayed. He was a man who prayed. He may have thought of his uncle Sherku, who had ridden into Egypt with him 30 years before, who had carried him toward all of this and not lived to see it. He may have thought of Nur, who had built the vision and not lived to see it fulfilled. He may have thought of his father, the quiet, capable man from Tikrit, who had waited until the household was in order before he traveled, and who had never known what he had sent into the world. He may simply have stood there, in the old city, in the evening, in the specific silence that comes after a very long effort arrives at the thing it was working toward, when the work itself was so consuming that the arrival feels, in the first moment, almost impossible to believe, like a word you've said so many times it has briefly lost its meaning, and you have to stand quietly until the meaning comes back. The first stars were beginning to appear above the rooftops of Jerusalem, the same stars that had always been there, the same enormous, patient sky.
He had the city. He had done what the world had given him the extraordinary and terrible gift of being the person who could do. He had done it in a way that he had reason to believe, without certainty but with genuine hope, was worthy of the people who had trusted him, worthy of the faith that had formed him, worthy of the Father who had taught him that how you do a thing is part of the thing itself. And now there was the question of what came next, because Jerusalem was not the end. It could not be the end. The world that had sent the first crusade was still there. The faith that had built those Crusader kingdoms was still there. The political and military reality that had existed before Hattin had changed but had not vanished, and the Third Crusade was already forming in the minds of the kings of Europe. News traveling slowly, but traveling. Richard of England already beginning to think about ships and armies and the enormous ocean-crossing commitment of a man who believed that what had just happened in Jerusalem required an answer. The answer was coming, and Saladin, standing in the evening city he had spent his life moving toward, was going to have to turn around and face it. He was tired. The letter was not wrong. The tiredness that sleep could not touch had been building for years and had not been resolved by the victory, because that is the specific character of that kind of tiredness. It is not created by the difficulty of the task and cannot therefore be ended by its completion. He was also, underneath the tiredness, something else, something quieter and steadier than any of the feelings that had driven the decades of effort. He was at peace with himself in the specific way of a man who has done the thing he was given to do, not perfectly, not without cost,
not without the various compromises and accommodations and imperfect decisions that any real life in a real world requires, but honestly, with the best of himself applied to the best purpose he could find. That was what he carried into the years that were still ahead of him, the peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the knowledge that you have not betrayed the thing inside you that knows the difference between what you are doing and what you should be doing. The Third Crusade was gathering on the other side of the sea. 3 years of the most demanding military and diplomatic campaign of his life were coming. Richard of England was coming, the most feared warrior in Christendom, the man who would eventually call Saladin the finest king in the world, was sailing toward him with everything the combined power of the European kingdoms could provide. And somewhere in a city in the middle of the night, a man who had been a boy on a road was sitting with the last hours of something that was ending and the first hours of something he could not yet fully see, the way we all sit sometimes in the dark between one thing and the next, holding what has been and trying to find the shape of what is still coming. The Third Crusade arrived the way all enormous things arrive, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece large enough on its own to require everything you have, and then the next piece arriving before you have finished with the first. Richard of England reached the coast of the Holy Land in June of 1191, and everything the stories had said about him was true, and some of it was an understatement. He was physically extraordinary, tall and fair, and built with the specific proportions of a man whose body seemed to have been designed for exactly the kind of warfare that the 12th century required. He was tactically brilliant in the direct, immediate, instinctive way that some people are brilliant at music, not from study primarily, but from a deep natural relationship with the thing itself. He was also almost completely without the political patience that Saladin had spent decades cultivating, and this made him simultaneously more dangerous in a single engagement and less dangerous across the long arc of a campaign that would ultimately be decided by something other than any single engagement. Saladin watched Richard the way he had always watched people he needed to understand, with complete attention and without the distortion of either contempt or fear.
What he saw was a man who was, in the deepest sense, his opposite. Not his enemy in the simple sense of the word, but his counterpart. The thing that the world had placed across from him to test whether everything he had built and everything he had become was actually what he believed it was. Richard was pure force. Saladin was force in the service of something. Richard was the weapon. Saladin was the hand that understood why the weapon should or should not be used, and in which direction, and to what end. The campaigns of the Third Crusade were brutal in the way that all medieval warfare was brutal, and the accounts of specific engagements carry a weight of violence that is not softened by the distance of 8 centuries. Men died in numbers that the surviving sources could only approximate. Cities changed hands and changed them back. The coastal city of Acre fell to Richard after a siege that cost both sides an enormous price in lives and in the specific currency of morale that is harder to replenish than men or supplies. Saladin lost Acre. He stood on a hill above the city and watched it fall, and felt what a man feels when something he has been responsible for is taken from him despite everything he could bring to its defense. The particular grief of insufficiency, the gap between what was required and what was possible, closing in the wrong direction. He did not collapse. He did not rage in the way that the sources record some of his commanders raging. He was very still by the accounts of those around him that day. Still in the way that is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of a feeling so large that it has nowhere to go except inward, being held and processed and converted into the next decision. The cool evening air on the hill above the lost city, the sound of the sea below, indifferent, continuing. He regrouped. He adapted. He did what he had always done. He took the situation as it actually was, rather than as he needed it to be, and he worked with what was real. The campaign settled into a grinding, attritional pattern that suited Saladin's strengths better than Richard's, because Richard needed resolution, and Saladin could wait, had always been able to wait, with a patience that came from the specific confidence of a man whose foundation was not dependent on the outcome of any single engagement. They fought at Arsuf. They maneuvered through the coastal plain. They came close, tantalizingly and frustratingly close to Richard, to the gates of Jerusalem twice, and twice Richard pulled back, because his military intelligence told him that taking Jerusalem was possible, but holding it against a Saladin who controlled the surrounding territory was not. And Richard, for all his directness, was not stupid about the difference between a city captured and a city held. The two men never met in person. This is one of those historical facts that sounds like it should be wrong, given the nature of what they were to each other and to the story. There are accounts of near meetings, of negotiations conducted through intermediaries, where the intermediaries recorded that each man spoke of the other with a quality of attention and respect that was clearly personal rather than merely diplomatic. Richard sent messages that Saladin answered. Saladin sent gifts, fruit and snow-cooled water when Richard was ill, gestures that the military world of that century understood as something beyond strategy, as the behavior of a man who distinguished between his enemy and his enemy's suffering. Richard sent back word that Saladin was the greatest ruler in the Islamic world. Saladin sent back word that Richard was the greatest ruler in the Christian world. These were not pleasantries. They were assessments made by men who understood exactly what they were assessing, because they were each other's most qualified judges. The war ended not with a decisive battle, but with a treaty, the Treaty of Ramla in 1192, which left Jerusalem in Muslim hands and gave Christian pilgrims the right of access to the holy sites within it. It was not everything Richard had come for. It was not a complete vindication of everything Saladin had built. It was the thing that wars between roughly matched opponents usually end as, a negotiated recognition of what the military and political reality actually was, dressed in the language of agreement. Richard left the Holy Land in October of 1192. He sailed away from the coast he had crossed an entire sea to reach, carrying with him the complicated weight of a man who has performed extraordinary feats and not quite accomplished the thing those feats were performed for. He was a great man who had been given the wrong kind of greatness for the problem he was trying to solve. Saladin watched the fleet disappear and felt something that the sources, with their characteristic precision about the external and their appropriate caution about the internal, do not fully describe. Relief, certainly. The relief of a man whose body has been held at maximum tension for more than a year, and which is now, slowly, being allowed to remember what ordinary tension feels like. And something else, something more complicated than victory, and more honest than satisfaction.
He was 54 years old. The body that had carried him through Egypt and Syria and Palestine and back again, through 30 years of campaigning in some of the most demanding physical environments that the medieval world contained, was beginning to present its accounting in the specific way that bodies do when they have been asked for too much over too long, and are now presenting the invoice with the firm politeness of a creditor who has been patient but is no longer willing to wait. He went to Damascus. He had not been in Damascus for a long time, in the way that a man is in a place when he is actually there, present and still, and not preparing for the next departure.
He arrived in November of 1192, and he seems, from everything the accounts record about those final months, to have understood that this was the return that would not be followed by another campaign, not through any dramatic announcement or formal withdrawal, but through the quiet, private recognition of a man who has been paying close attention to himself for 50 years and knows the difference between a body that is tired and a body that is finishing. He gave. This is the word that the historians return to most consistently when they describe the final months of Saladin's life. He gave. He distributed from the treasury to the poor, to scholars, to the institutions of the city, to individuals who came to him with needs that he had the power to address. He gave with the specific energy of a man who is not accumulating things for a future that he believes he has in unlimited supply, but dispersing things from a finite store with the awareness that the store is finite. Those around him recorded that he was cheerful. This is the word they use, and it surprises every reader who encounters it for the first time, because it seems wrong for a man in declining health at the end of an exhausting life. But it isn't wrong. It is exactly right for the kind of man he was. A man whose cheerfulness was not a performance of happiness, but the natural expression of a person who at the deepest level was at peace with what his life had been, and was not spending his remaining energy arguing with the fact that it was ending. He held gatherings of scholars and poets and judges in the evenings, the kind of evenings he had always loved most, full of the specific pleasure of ideas being examined seriously by people who genuinely cared about them, full of language being used with precision and affection, full of the warm smell of the city he had loved since childhood, coming through the open windows in the winter air. He rode out sometimes in the early mornings, not far, not with any military purpose, but in the way that a person visits the things they love when they have understood that they are saying goodbye, without announcing that's what they're doing, without making the thing into an occasion, just looking, just being in the presence of something they will miss. The old city in the morning light, the sound of the water channels that had been running through Damascus since before memory, the call to prayer rising over the rooftops in the cold dawn air, the same call that had shaped every day of his life since he was a child old enough to hear it and understand what it was asking. He became ill in late February of 1193. The sources describe a fever, which was the common language of that era for a variety of conditions that modern medicine would name differently, but which shared the common feature of overwhelming a body that had no remaining reserves to fight with. He was attended by physicians. He was surrounded by those close to him. He continued to give audience and to speak, and to be present with the people around him with the specific quality of attention that had always characterized him, interested, warm, genuinely there. He asked for the Quran to be read aloud. The sources record that he listened with closed eyes and an expression that the men around him described as peaceful, which is the word that appears across multiple accounts written by multiple observers, peaceful, as if the words were not new to him, but instead the most familiar thing in the world, the long conversation that had been going on since before he could remember, and that was now, in some form, completing itself. He died on the 4th of March, 1193. He was 55 years old. He had been Sultan of Egypt and Syria. He had unified an Islamic world that had been fractured for generations. He had taken back the city that 3 faiths called sacred, and had done it in a manner that the people he defeated wrote about with bewilderment and something approaching gratitude. He had been a father and a brother and a nephew and a student and a soldier and an administrator and a man who wrote letters in the dark asking for just enough. When his treasurers counted what remained in his personal estate, they found 47 silver coins and a single piece of gold. The man who had controlled the wealth of Egypt and Syria for 2 decades had given everything away. There was not enough money in his personal possession to pay for his own funeral. His friends paid for it.
The simplicity of that fact has been sitting in the historical record for 8 centuries, quietly making its point to everyone who encounters it. And now, knowing everything we know about him, go back for a moment to that boy we met at the beginning of this story, the newborn on the road out of Tikrit, carried west in the dark by a father who believed that how you do a thing is part of the thing itself. Go back to the first description of that road, the stars above it, the movement through the night towards something that couldn't yet be seen. Hear it again now, with everything you know. The boy being carried toward the life that was waiting for him, the enormous sky above a small child, and the enormous life inside that child not yet begun. The whole story was always in that image. It was there from the first word. You simply needed to travel the distance to be able to see it. He left behind something that the world has been living inside ever since. Not a territory or a dynasty. Both of those changed and changed again in the centuries after him, but a way of understanding what power is for. A demonstration, specific and historical and completely real, that the highest form of strength is not the capacity for destruction, but the capacity for restraint. That winning means nothing if the manner of winning empties the victory of everything that made the victory worth pursuing. His name has never faded. 8 centuries, and his name is still the name that the Islamic world offers when it wants to describe what a leader should be. Still the name that European historians return to when they want to describe a chivalry that exceeded their own tradition's best practice. Still the name that teachers of ethics and military law and political philosophy place in front of students who need an example of someone who had complete power and chose not to use it completely. The citadel of Cairo still stands on the hill where he built it, looking out over the city he governed, with the care of someone who understood that the city was not his possession, but his responsibility. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem still stands on the ground he walked across in the October evening of 1187, golden in the afternoon light, visible from everywhere in the city, the physical center of the story that his life was built around. You have traveled a long way tonight, from a road in northern Iraq in 1138 to a room in Damascus in 1193, across a life so large and so deeply human that even now, 8 centuries later, it is still teaching anyone who comes to it with an open mind and a quiet hour. You can rest now. The story is complete. Sleep well the way Saladin slept when the prayer was finished and the city was quiet and the work of the day had been done with full attention and the night was his own at last. Sleep well the way the scholars slept in Damascus after the long evenings of beautiful argument, tired in the good way, the way that comes from having used your mind on something that deserved it. Sleep well the way the city sleeps that has survived everything, the old stones cool in the dark, the water running in the channels as it has always run, carrying the night through toward morning. Good night, and carry something of him with you into the dark, the quiet reminder that how you do a thing is part of the thing itself, and that just enough, asked for honestly and used faithfully, has always been more than it sounds. The stars above Damascus tonight are the same stars that were above the road from Tikrit, the same patient light that watched a father carry a newborn west through the summer dark toward a life that would change the world. Not knowing, none of them knowing, the road still stretching ahead, the night still full of everything that had not yet happened.